welcome back everyone. We're again here continuing our broadcasts Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, focused again for now on the new coronavirus, the CCP virus. And we're going to be starting today going into some odd incidents taking place in Wuhan, the epicenter of this virus. We're also going to be going into how pressure is now building even further to investigate China as the possible origin of this virus. And we're also going to be looking into some of the regime's different forms of overseas pressure. So stick around for that, folks. Before we get started, though, again, this channel is being censored. We received alerts from YouTube stating they are restricting advertisements on some of our content on the grounds that we're promoting hateful content. Now, of course, I posed the question in the last episode whether you folks agree with that, and it seemed overwhelmingly that you do not feel I'm promoting hateful content, and I'm glad to hear that. YouTube, however, does seem to think otherwise, and so again, we're asking for your support. If you can, when you look for this channel, maybe not every time, but at least sometimes, do search for it on the YouTube search engine. Just type in Crossroads with Joshua Philipp, or Crossroads, and click through it there. It'll help us get ranked a little better on here. And if you can, also please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you use those. Again, it helps us as well. Some of the odd incidents taking place in Wuhan right now. Now, there was an interesting video taken from the ground in Wuhan just recently on May 9th, which Epoch Times has reported on. And what it shows is individuals in full medical gear loading what appear to be patients into the back of a transport truck. There are many ambulances lined up along in front of it, but they're, in the video at least, they're loading them into what looks like almost like a military transport truck with a tarp along the back. The individuals loading them in are in full medical garb, completely covered, and it's being done from a hotel, not from a hospital. And of course, people are wondering now what is going on with this. Now, the Epoch Times looked into it. This is at the entrance of Li Feng Hotel. Again, it's a large transport truck. There are several ambulances lined up. It's unclear what exactly happened there. There's no reports on it, no government reports on it. There's, completely silent, essentially. And now, interestingly, at the same time this took place, China, the CCP, fired an official after a new coronavirus case emerged in a Wuhan community. This is a quote from Wall Street Journal. It says, authorities in Wuhan fired a local official after 6 new COVID-19 cases were confirmed over the weekend in a housing complex under his jurisdiction, in a sign of the government's anxieties about the possibility of a resurgence of the original center of the pandemic. Now, tying this together, this is interesting for 2 reasons. When it comes to this individual being fired, of course, this is being fired over 6 cases, allegedly at a community center. This calls into question the nature of what happened to this hotel. Were these the patients who were moved out of these hospitals? Because, of course, as we reported before, when the CCP reopened Wuhan on April 8th, they emptied out the hospitals. But reports we had said the individuals, and of course other reports, said they were being moved to other hospitals, not to hotels. And so who were these individuals at the hotels now being loaded up into what appear to be ambulances and at the very least a large transport vehicle? What is going on here? The other question it raises is, the other issue it raises is that this individual, this Chinese official, was fired because there were 6 new cases in this community center. Now, from a certain standpoint, yes, you could argue that he was fired because of mishandling of, say, quarantine, of mishandling things which allowed the virus to spread within this community center. But this is also a reason why local officials are doing 2 things. One is they're going overboard with their approaches in cracking down on the virus, and 2, they're not reporting to their higher authorities what is actually taking place. My own personal analysis of others I know, is that even the CCP, even the Chinese Communist Party itself, very likely does not have a full picture of what's taking place, because they have incentivized not reporting among low-level officials. And so low-level officials like this one who was just arrested was punished because, of course, it came out that there were virus cases in his community. Now you could say he would have other officials get two messages from that. One is they need to take harsh actions to make sure that there are no outbreaks in their community. And two, if there are outbreaks in their community, it means they need to cover them up, because this is what happens to them. Now, moving on, pressure is continuing to build for investigations into China as the possible origin of this virus. And of course, from the get-go, that has been the story. Even the Chinese regime talked about originally how it emerged from this wet market in Wuhan. And of course, over time, through propaganda campaigns, changed that narrative, turned around and blamed it on the United States, blamed it on France, blamed it on Italy. And of course, they're calling it the USA virus in China, and they're saying it's racist or discriminatory or fake news to suggest that the virus could have come from China, which is of course what all the original reports said, and of course what all the data is pointing to. But investigations are now underway to double confirm that, I guess we could say. And interestingly now, a lot of the investigations are also looking into how the Chinese regime covered up the outbreak of the virus during its emergence. So we have a few stories here. First up from Fox Business, pressure ramps up on China after report it withheld coronavirus information. Again from Fox, state attorney generals ask Congress to hold hearings investigating China's deceit in coronavirus response. And also Washington Post, GOP to launch China task force that Democrats bailed on. I mean, fair enough, there does seem to be pretty bipartisan support in terms of condemning the Chinese regime, in terms of calling for investigations. Notably, there was bipartisan support for Taiwan entering the WHO. State attorney generals are asking Congress to hold hearings investigating China's deceit in the coronavirus case. This does suggest that these attorney generals are interested in bringing cases against the CCP. As I've mentioned before, these investigations very likely will not be investigations in and of themselves that will end with, say, a government condemnation of the CCP. Very likely, following very closely behind these investigations will be lawsuits, not just in the United States but internationally, and not just at the Attorney General level, not just at the possible country level and state level, but also on the individual level, with class action lawsuits. We've seen many of these getting filed. And now on to the WHO, because there are a few things moving around when it comes to the WHO. Of course, the WHO right now there are, again, calls for investigations into the Chinese regime's cover-up of the virus. There are also calls for investigation into the WHO and whether it also covered up information. At the very least, the WHO was repeating false information fed to it by the Chinese regime, which has called its credibility into question. First off, Bloomberg News. What we don't know about coronavirus origin might kill us. And notably, this Bloomberg article is backing the idea that the WHO should be the organization to investigate the possible origin of this virus in China. And this is interesting for a couple reasons. One is, again, I mentioned in a previous episode, the Chinese Communist Party is saying that any calls for investigation are hostile to China, that it will not allow any investigations, and it's saying it especially will not allow investigations into a possible origin of the virus until this whole thing is said and done with. But with that said, they said that they would support the WHO investigating it. And so what in the eyes of the Chinese regime makes the WHO different? What in the eyes of the Chinese regime makes the WHO an exception to that pressure, an exception to the idea that any country, not just the United States, but Australia, Europe, you name it, that any country, any organization investigating them is somehow a threat, but the WHO is not? What is the difference? Now this is interesting because, of course, this is a very contentious headline. It's playing on the idea that not having an investigation into the origins and nature of this virus is something that, of course, might kill us. I'd kind of agree with that, actually. I think it is important we get answers on it. Now, in addition to this, the WHO is now saying that it's okay for the Chinese regime to reopen its wet markets. And this is interesting for a couple reasons as well. One is, if the virus origin was in fact not from a lab, which is of course what a lot of the investigations are going to be looking into now, then it calls into question what are the other narratives. The other main narrative pushed by the Chinese regime is that it came from this wet market in Wuhan. the Hunan seafood market where they have these live animals. Now, it's interesting again on 2 points, one being that the Chinese regime's narrative on that now is claiming that China has no such thing as wet markets, that these are not a concept in China, that these do not exist. And I was laughing about that before, saying, actually I think we should just agree with China on this one, let them have it, because if wet markets don't exist, then it calls into question the basis of their argument, their original narrative, and where this virus came from. And it of course raises the question of, well, if it didn't come from a wet market because they don't exist in China, then one, you lied to us during your initial arguments. Again, if there's no such thing as wet markets in China, how can they reopen? Now, one of the reasons why the WHO might be backing the idea that it's okay for China to be reopening these wet markets is because the Chinese regime is doing it. And of course, every single step of the way, the WHO has been supporting and backing whatever the Chinese regime does and whatever the Chinese regime says. And on this idea of independence, the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives have sent letters to 55 countries requesting support for Taiwan's entry into the WHO. And again, why is that significant? Taiwan is, of course, its own country. The Chinese regime does not regard Taiwan as its own country. For a long time, Taiwan was recognized as the government in exile of China. The Chinese Communist Party was seen as the illegitimate government. It was actually the United Nations that first recognized Taiwan as kind of the illegitimate government and the Chinese Communist Party as the legitimate one. And the United States followed on that soon after. After that happened, Taiwan has somewhat fallen to the wayside when it comes to international order. And Taiwan is now requesting access to the WHO. The United States is backing it. Now we have the House of Representatives and the Senate backing it, and of course many other countries backing it. And so what does WHO say? Here we have Reuters. WHO says it has no mandate to invite Taiwan to assembly meeting. The World Health Organization's Director General has, quote, no mandate to invite Taiwan to take part in its assembly next week, the body lawyer said on Monday, adding member states had, quote, divergent views on the self-ruled island's participation. Now, as I've mentioned, my analysis on this is that the question of whether the WHO allows Taiwan in, because Taiwan has of course been one of the major players during this virus. Arguably, its handling of this virus has been one of the best in the world. And Taiwan, this whole way through, has been very critical of the Chinese regime, and the Chinese regime has been very critical of Taiwan, trying to block its entry, block its legitimacy, and also criticizing different countries that turn around and try to support Taiwan. The question of whether the WHO allows Taiwan into its meetings is one to show whether the WHO is actually independent or whether it is a sock puppet of the Chinese Communist Party. And it appears now that it is acting at the behest of the CCP on this, noting that member states have, quote, divergent views. Moving on, you may remember stories about how Canada ordered protective equipment, personal protective equipment, PPE, from China to protect its frontline health workers against the virus, and how stories came out saying that the equipment they got from China was non-functional. Now, Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, is saying Canada will not pay for that equipment. There are calls in Canada right now, for example, among high-level officials to use the Magnitsky Act against China for its handling of this virus, notably this act being one that could hold countries accountable for human rights abuses. This was previously used against Russia. And also, Hong Kong pro-democracy supporters have donated 120,000 masks to Canada. And given the context of timing on this, that Canada found that the masks they had received from mainland China were non-functional and is saying they will not pay for them, and then Hong Kong pro-democracy supporters donating 120,000 masks. For the Chinese regime, this is seen as a very large slap in the face. Because not only is Canada showing the world that the Chinese regime's masks are unreliable, not only is it showing that there are problems of quality, it is showing that you can take a stand and refuse to pay. And this ties into something bigger that is now taking place, which is that the Chinese regime's decades and decades of work on soft power, political influence, media influence, academic influence, business influence, is now falling to pieces. Taiwan News and other outlets have been posting a photograph showing the words CCP virus being projected onto the Chinese consulate building in Los Angeles. Japan is teaming up with 400 companies to cut reliance on China medical goods. China risks being left out of the new global economic order, Beijing's former trade chief warns. China could face isolation from the global economic order post-coronavirus, warned Beijing's former chief trade negotiator Long Yong-tu, who shepherded the country into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now again, folks, I'm going to go over these headlines and give a broader analysis at the end of it. In New Zealand, China berates New Zealand over support for Taiwan at WHO. There is textbook discrimination, according to NPR. Human Rights Report accuses China of mistreating Africans. The Age reports, quote, China relations sour over tariff threat to Australian barley, which was again in retaliation of Australia calling for investigations into the possible origin of this virus in China. We have a story here that says, quote, Chinese death threats for Polish illustrator, her boss wants her fired. It is possible those death threats are coming from organizations such as the 50 Cent Army, paid internet trolls of the Chinese regime under its propaganda department. In Wuhan, back to the epicenter of this virus in China, people are protesting against the Chinese regime. Now, what happened is the Chinese authorities there wanted to build a large power station in a densely populated area. The people took to the streets to protest. The Chinese authorities cracked down on them, arrested them, beat them, and so on, showing again that the Chinese people seem to be not afraid, as they once were, or much less so, of the Chinese regime. Now to the U.S. Story from Reuters. U.S. tightens visa rules for Chinese journalists amid coronavirus tensions. Now there's been a tit-for-tat between the U.S. and China over, say, press freedom, if we want to call it that. Now, the United States has listed 5 different Chinese state-run news outlets as official foreign missions of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese regime then banned 3 Wall Street Journal reporters from China, taking away their visas, and of course went after journalists of other media. The U.S. went back again and then restricted the number of employees some of these Chinese state-run media in the U.S. can have. The Chinese regime has, of course, retaliated on that. This has gone back and forth. Now the U.S. is again tightening visa rules for Chinese journalists, namely Chinese journalists at state-run media, not ethnically Chinese journalists per se. And the Chinese regime is fighting back on this again. Now from Washington Post, quote, Beijing has warned it would like to take, quote, countermeasures unless the Trump administration corrected its decision to limit visas for all Chinese journalists posted in the United States, currently open-ended to 90 days. Now the statement's nonsense, of course. It's not going after visas for all Chinese journalists in the United States. There are many journalists who are from many different countries, ethnically Chinese, who have no ties whatsoever to the CCP and who are not being targeted by this. This is specifically going after Chinese state-run media. And so this is an omission of fact that is painting a very different picture. But now continuing on, this says the Foreign Ministry spokesman of China, Zhao Lijian, said Monday, quote, we deplore and reject the erroneous move by the U.S. side, which is an escalation of its political suppression of Chinese media. Again, total nonsense. These Chinese media it's going against are state-run media of the Chinese Communist Party, many of which were already registered under FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, many of which were already violating FARA. For example, China Daily, registered as a foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party and also under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, it was violating, allegedly, of course, the Foreign Agents Registration Act by placing paid inserts in close to 30 U.S. publications, among them New York Times, Washington Post, many, many others, which is basically state-run propaganda paid for, put into U.S. publications from the Chinese regime. There was a group of U.S. lawmakers who wrote an open letter calling out China Daily for this and calling for investigations into it, again noting that China Daily was violating the FARA Act by doing so, because it was not disclosing all the publications it was putting these inserts in, and it was also not disclosing how much money it has been paying to major U.S. publications to run its propaganda. And of course, what the United States has been asking for with the Chinese regime is to allow the same degree of press freedom that we allow them in this country, in their country. Many journalists, many academics in China are living in the Truman Show. Every individual they encounter, every bit of information fed to them is what the Chinese regime wants them to report. It is what they want them to show the outside world. And so what are we looking at with this whole picture? We're looking at a picture where different countries, just about all across the world, we talked about Japan, we talked about New Zealand, Australia, we talked about many parts of the United States. We talked about different countries in Europe. All of them in different ways breaking from the Chinese regime. And notably, the Chinese regime, as we've reported previously, is launching what they call wolf warrior diplomacy. It's a very hardline, very aggressive form of diplomacy, where any statement against the regime, any criticism of the regime is met with very sharp countermeasures, counter-criticism, counter-threats, and that is backfiring. Many countries are now seeing right through the Chinese Communist Party, because before all this happened, they always had a benign facade. They always wore a mask of friendliness, and that mask has fallen off. Now that said, folks, again, we broadcast 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, so please don't forget to tune in. If you haven't already, please also do not forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support. If you want to show additional support, we of course do take donations, and for those who've donated, again, really, really appreciate it. Now, some of you have also asked what you can do facing some of the issues with the Chinese regime we're seeing right now. The Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, condemnation, and rejection of the Chinese Communist Party. If you want to sign that petition, go to ccpvirustruth.com. If you want to go the extra mile, tell 5 friends about it as well. Now, with that said, folks, really, genuinely thank you again. Please take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. We'll see you next time.